G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Episode 2.17, Recovering the Bible, a Century of Revelations. In the last episode, I introduced those fan favourites, the Essenes. Much of our image of the sect is derived from the collection of scrolls found at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, with which the Essenes are famously associated. The traditional consensus is that those scrolls were written by and for the Essenes. But arguments can be made that very few of the scrolls originate with the sect, and that we have no idea which groups produced them or why, and how they ended up at Qumran. If that is so, then we really know very little of the Essenes. Let's explore those famous scrolls. The unearthing of the scrolls culminated 100 years of astonishing literary revelations. I have to rewind to the beginning of that century of discovery. In 1850, the world of the ancient Middle East and Egypt was only just beginning to reveal itself. The language of ancient Egypt had been cracked, and the ancient languages of Mesopotamia were on the verge of decipherment. The most ancient documents the Victorians had were stone inscriptions and cuneiform tablets. By accident and bravado, European archaeological swashbucklers had uncovered a bewildering range of material that could be unquestionably dated to the most ancient periods of Egypt and Mesopotamia, Assyria and Babylon and Persia. I discussed those archaeological buccaneers in episode 1.4, Recovering Ancient Israel. The archaeological jigsaw slowly assembled itself in the last half of the 19th century, to the delight of an inquisitive and wondering Europe. The archaeology was coming along nicely, but the jigsaw that was the literature of the Bible stubbornly remained a confusing collection of unrelated pieces. The Victorians had no ancient biblical manuscripts. Victorian scholars could not date manuscripts with anything like the accuracy we can achieve today, but they could certainly tell the difference between a medieval parchment 1,000 years old and an ancient one 2,000 years old. As far as the Victorians could work out, almost every ancient piece of biblical vellum or leather they had was no older than the High Middle Ages. The oldest known biblical manuscript was the Leningrad Codex, a Hebrew edition of the Jewish Tanakh, Old Testament, which dated itself to the year 1009, at the tail end of the early Middle Ages. It's called a codex because it is in the form of a book, not a scroll. This treasure had been unearthed in the early 19th century by the Jewish entrepreneur and inveterate manuscript collector Abraham Furkovich. Furkovich never explained how he acquired it. By 1850, it was housed in the Russian Imperial Library. A major puzzle was the nature of the parabiblical literature. This huge collection of documents was obviously related to the Bible, but in unknown ways. These crazy books had been floating around since the Middle Ages, dug up from obscure European and Byzantine monasteries. The Victorians also knew of the strange Ethiopian canon. This Bible contained books unknown to other Christians, most notably Enoch and Jubilees. No one had any idea where they came from. The consensus in 1850 was that the Parabibs were Christian fan fiction, written sometime in the Middle Ages. A series of discoveries sent biblical scholars into a frenzy. They still haven't recovered. At St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, the German scholar Constantine von Tischendorf found a vast parchment Bible. It contained most of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament made in Hellenistic times, and a Greek version of the New Testament. Today it is known as Codex Sinaiticus and is regarded as a global treasure. As Tischendorf suspected, and modern research has supported, this Bible dates from about 350, in the earliest decades of the Christian Roman Empire. There is a possibility it was a Bible commissioned by the Emperor Constantine himself. It joins its sister codices, Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, as the oldest Christian Bibles known. I will have reams to say about them in later episodes. Tischendorf had recovered the most ancient Christian biblical manuscript. He had pushed back the oldest known biblical document by centuries. While Tischendorf was collating, studying, and publishing the massive Codex Sinaiticus, other adventurers stumbled on documents not only more ancient, but also completely unexpected. The first really astonishing discovery of Victorian scholarship was the document called the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. Early church fathers had often referred to it, but only in passing. Some of the fathers even considered it canonical. As we now know, the Ethiopian Orthodox preserved a version in their New Testament. An adventurous Greek bishop recovered a complete manuscript of the Didache from a monastery in Istanbul and published his discovery in the 1880s. Its impact was huge. For the first time, scholars had an undoubtedly ancient manuscript of a parabiblical book. It was probably as old as parts of the New Testament, and a good 200 years older than the Codex Sinaiticus. Today, the manuscript is dated to the very end of the Apostolic Age, around 100 AD. The Didache is totally unlike anything in the New Testament. It is a book of church order. In 16 short chapters, it deals with morals and ethics, church practice, and the hope of the second coming of Christ at the end of time. The book presents a general program for instruction and initiation into the primitive church. The book poses many puzzles. Here, for example, the book explains how to hold the Eucharist. Quote, Didache 9:1, and concerning the Eucharist, first, concerning the cup. We give thanks to thee, our Father, for the holy vine of David thy child, which thou didst make known to us through Jesus thy child. To thee be glory for ever. And concerning the broken bread, we give thee thanks, our Father, for the life and knowledge which thou didst make known to us through Jesus thy child. To thee be glory for ever. As this broken bread was scattered upon the mountains, but was brought together and became one, so let thy church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into thy kingdom. For thine is the glory and the power, through Jesus Christ for ever. But let none eat or drink of your Eucharist, except those who have been baptized in the Lord's name. For concerning this also did the Lord say, Give not that which is holy to the dogs. End quote. Notice something missing, something really important. There is no reference at all to the death and sacrifice of Jesus. This is the whole symbolic point of the Eucharist in modern Christianity. At about the same time as the Didache was unearthed, a French team stumbled on the early medieval tomb of a Christian monk in a town on the Nile about 600 kilometres south of the Mediterranean. What was important was not the tomb, but the manuscripts found in it. The monk had been buried with a parchment manuscript that contained the Gospel of Peter and the Apocalypse of Peter, books mentioned by the Church Fathers. These were surprises. The Didache and the books of Peter brought home to late Victorian professors the existence of a completely unexpected testimony to Christian diversity. I'll get back to all these books in later episodes. The Victorians were primed for more exciting discoveries. They were awash with cuneiform tablets from Assyria and Babylon. They had almost nothing from ancient Judaism. In 1896, two Scottish sisters and their, and I'll quote them, irrepressibly curious rabbinical friend, Solomon Schechter, investigated a Geniza at the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Fustat, or Old Cairo in Egypt. You can think of a synagogue Geniza as something like a sacred storeroom, if you are feeling generous, or a rubbish dump, if you are not. You probably have a Geniza, although you call it an attic, basement, or shed. That's where you keep all those ancient photographs of relatives dead 50 years. You feel it would be sacrilegious to throw them into a dumpster, but you feel no compulsion to keep these relics in the house, let alone preserve them from mice and fungi. The Cairo Geniza contained 300,000 Jewish manuscript fragments, written over a period of 1,000 years from the early Middle Ages onwards. They are the largest and most diverse collection of medieval manuscripts in the world. The Geniza texts are written in various languages, but especially Hebrew, Arabic and Aramaic, mainly on vellum and paper, but also on papyrus and cloth. Schechter realized he had won a lottery that no one else even thought existed. For 50 years, the Cairo Geniza manuscripts were the talk of the intellectual town. But in one sense they were disappointing. The manuscripts did indeed push back the histories of some biblical books into a much more distant past. Now that was gratifying. But the only real surprise from the trove was an otherwise unknown book, later called the Damascus document, because it mentions the city of Damascus so often. I'll get to that soon. Schechter was confronted with many questions. Where did the manuscripts come from? Who wrote them? When were they written? By struggling with these basic questions, Schechter founded modern scroll research. A few years later, some fragments of the Ten Commandments in Hebrew turned up in Egyptian antiquities markets, fragments now known as the Nash Papyri. These were clearly very old, but how old? In the late 1930s, the scholar William F. Albright had a bright idea. Albright was the preeminent force in biblical archaeology at the time. I went through his story in episode 1.6, Canaan of the Patriarchs. Albright decided to compare the handwriting in the papyri with Hebrew stone inscriptions that could be reliably dated. He decided that the Nash Papyri were probably written in Maccabean times, which made them by far the oldest Hebrew manuscripts found. And so Albright founded the science of paleography, which is now often used to arrive at approximate dates for manuscripts. Albright had added a new and powerful instrument to the scholarly toolbox. By the 1940s, the literary situation was not much advanced on 1900. The oldest Jewish and Hebrew biblical manuscript was the Leningrad Codex, written a few decades before the time of William the Conqueror. The oldest Christian and Greek biblical manuscript was the Codex Sinaiticus, perhaps written about 350. The Didache was still the most interesting and oldest Christian manuscript earth, and the Nash Papyri, the most ancient Jewish documents. Then, in 1947, at a single stroke, the Dead Sea Scrolls gave the world another 1,000 years of the Bible's history, and it transformed the parabiblical books from inexplicable curios to windows into a lost Judaism. Portions of the scrolls first appeared in Israeli antiquities markets. They soon came to the attention of American archaeologists working in Jerusalem. By comparing the writing on the scrolls against the Nash papyri, they became convinced that the scrolls were at least as old as those most antique of fragments. But where the Nash papyri were only fragments, the archaeologists were now flooded with ancient documents. They were ecstatic. The story the archaeologists heard was that the scrolls had been found by Arab Bedouin in some caves near Qumran, near the Dead Sea. The unpleasantness of the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 precluded further investigation in the war zone. Once the dust had settled from that conflict, archaeologists pounced on the caves and rabidly began to dig. They had unearthed the biblical find of the century. We do not know who assembled these scrolls and placed them into the caves, nor why. But clearly the concealers were convinced of the scrolls' importance. The term the Dead Sea Scrolls is now used to describe the many fragments found in the 12 caves near Qumran and a few other places in the Judean desert. The 12th cave was only found in 2017. By far the Lollapalooza cave is Cave 4, which contains almost 90% of all the fragments, some 15,000 of them. Almost all the fragments are leather, or its more refined versions, vellum and parchment. A very few are papyrus. One especially intriguing scroll is made of copper. The scrolls are given names such as 4Q246, which means the 246th fragment found in Cave 4 at Qumran. The scrolls can be readily divided into 3 groups. First are scrolls of the books of the Old Testament. Second are scrolls of parabiblical books, such as 1st Enoch and Jubilees. Third are a motley collection of documents, which today are known as sectarian works. All the scrolls are thoroughly Jewish, regardless of what you may have heard. Not one single scrap is from the New Testament. Only about a quarter of the manuscript represent books from the Tanakh. Fragments from every book except Esther have been found. No scroll contains more than 1/10 of a book, with the exception of the book of Isaiah, preserved in its entirety. The most common manuscripts are from Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and Genesis. These happen to be the most quoted books of the Old Testament, found in the New Testament. The historical books, Kings and Samuel and Chronicles, barely appear. Of these manuscripts from the Tanakh, about 40% follow the Masoretic textual tradition. Another 20% follow the Samaritan textual tradition. A tiny 4 manuscripts of Jeremiah and Samuel accord with the Septuagint. The rest do not fit in with any tradition. These scrolls fanned no flames of controversy in academia. They confirmed that the Masoretic tradition was remarkably faithful to its ancient forebears, but also that the Samaritan and Septuagint traditions could claim great antiquity. If only a quarter of the Dead Sea Scrolls are Hebrew Old Testament works, what are the rest? More than half of the Dead Sea Scrolls are parabiblical books. These were a huge surprise. The Testaments of Naphtali and Levi, the Aramaic Apocalypse, the Book of Giants, amongst many others. They contain copies of the books of 1st Enoch and Jubilees, found hitherto only in Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Dead Sea Scrolls have more copies of Jubilees than they have of Exodus or Leviticus. They have more copies of 1st Enoch and the Book of Giants than all the minor prophets put together, or the books of Daniel or Numbers. The Dead Sea Scrolls transformed the Parabibs from suspected Christian fan fiction and curios into major ancient Jewish texts. An even bigger surprise were the rest of the scrolls, about 20% of the whole. They are a varied collection of religious rules, scriptural commentary, hymns, prayers, lamentations, calendars, and legal texts. Usually these are called sectarian documents, to distinguish themselves from the biblical and parabiblical ones. But that is not a great name for them. The imputation behind the name is that they were produced by a single sect, identified as the Essenes. But that is very much to put the cart before the horse. Still, the label has stuck, and that is the label I will continue to use. The most important of these sectarian works are the Community Rule, the Damascus Document, the Temple Scroll, the War Scroll, and the Copper Scroll. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain many copies of the Community Scroll, dated to round about 100 BC. The scroll is a manual for the leaders of some sort of religious group, one that has no provision for marriage, women, or children. It includes extracts from liturgical ceremonies, an outline of a model sermon on truth and falsehood, rules concerning initiation, rules on the common life, organisation and discipline, and a penal code. In a lot of ways, the Community Scroll resembles the Christian book, the Didache. Portions of the Damascus document had turned up in the Cairo Geniza. At that time, no one could make head nor tail of it. Even when the whole thing appeared in the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars were still befuddled. It is similar to the Community Scroll, but reads much more like a law book of rules and instructions. The Temple Scroll is the physically longest of the scrolls, at over 8 metres and 9,000 words. The document is written in the form of a revelation from God to Moses. In the original Torah, an anonymous narrator tells us what God said to Moses. In this scroll, God speaks in the first person to Moses directly. The scroll rewrites the laws of the Torah, rearranges them, reformulates them, expands on them, and adds new laws. But it is no mere paraphrase of the Torah. Like the Book of Jubilees, the Temple Scroll presents itself as the Torah. The book claims that Solomon got Moses' instructions wrong when Solomon built the temple. The scroll now gives us the correct blueprints. The War Scroll is a military strategy, a plan for the final war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, a battle between the Israelites and the Gentiles and their demonic allies. Most of the text is a strategy for a military strike. This will allow the sons of light to launch a preemptive attack on the sons of darkness. The text is preoccupied with ridiculous military imagery, describing the trumpets and banners for the war, and liturgies for the priests during the conflict. It all sounds like it was written by a cushy, middle-class Jew who had no experience of hardship, let alone war, but was determined to record in detail how all the soldiers in his fantasy battles should be dressed in gorgeous regalia. Without doubt, the Copper Scroll is the most peculiar find amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. This document is an inventory of dozens of locations, of vast hidden treasures, of gold, silver, and gems. Think the dwarves in the Hobbit movies. There is nothing religious about it. The scroll is entirely secular. That it was engraved on expensive but durable copper implies that its author intended the document to endure through the ages. But why? No doctrine in Judaism encouraged hoarding wealth or burying treasure. There are a few rabbinical tales about the secret location of the Ark of the Covenant and such like, but no stories of hidden hoards of gold. The scrolls are the most important find in 20th century biblical archaeology. They are astonishing for 4 reasons. First, their sheer quantity. So far, scholars have identified about 1,000 manuscripts, although it is almost certain that many fragments thought to be from different works will in future be identified as parts of the same scroll. Second, their antiquity. The very earliest seem to have been written in Hellenistic times, and the very latest in the early Roman Empire. Third, for the light they shed on the Old Testament text. They push back the history of the earliest Hebrew manuscript by 1,000 years. Before the scrolls were found, the earliest Hebrew manuscript was the Leningrad Codex from the early Middle Ages. Fourth, and most important, they reveal a wholly new aspect to the intellectual life of Judaism in the Second Temple period, and force us to re-evaluate what we know about the Judaism and Christianity of the time. The scrolls show us that the Judaism of the Second Temple period was much more varied than Josephus or the New Testament had led us to believe. The intellectual ocean of the time was awash with writings, some of which made it into the canon and some of which did not. In the next episode, I peer into the secret places of modern biblical scholarship and tell the sordid tale of the greatest academic scandal of the 20th century, the suppression of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thanks for listening. For maps, charts and diagrams, check out my website www.historyinthebible.com.